Welcome to Unit 3, Exercise 8-4, Food Cost Percent. Here is where we wrap all of the skills we've taught all semester long, and we put it into a practical exercise that uses most of those skills in one spot. So let us begin with Exercise 8-4, and here's a little bit of a menu that we have for a banquet that we're giving. We have hors d'oeuvres, we have cream of asparagus soup, entrecote steak with onion rings, stuffed tomatoes, artichoke hearts, parsley potatoes, cream caramel, and coffee. No doubt a good meal, and this is what we're going to use to start answering some of our questions. The idea of this exercise is to use all three pyramids and the two unit costing formulas to figure out the answers. The important thing to keep in mind here is that we must read the questions very carefully and clearly understand what is needed so we don't use the wrong prices or numbers to do a certain calculation. So, keeping in mind the menu that we've just seen, they tell us that the present cost of the steak is $3.20 and the food cost percent is 40%. Those are the two pieces of information they give to start us off. The first question is they want to know what the selling price of the steak should be. So if you remember your selling price formula or pyramid, you'll remember that we need the cost of the food or the food cost, and we divide that by the food cost percent. So in this particular example, it's the cost of the steak divided by the food cost percent. That gives us a selling price of $8. Remember, this is the selling price. Let's move down to the next question. If the annual inflation rate is 4.5%, what would the cost of this steak be 1 year from now? And we want to round this off to the nearest cent. So, 1 year from now with an annual inflation rate of 4.5%. In other words, we have to add 4.5% to our cost of $3.20. Let's take a look at how we do that. There's our cost of $3.20. We multiply it by 45% and add it back to the $3.20 to give us a new cost of $3.34. You can see that we've gone from $3.20 to $3.34. That's the difference in inflation rate. Or if you want to do it one step less, take the present cost of $3.20, multiply it by itself, or 1.045, or $3.20 times 1.045, and we will get to the exact same place no matter what step you take. Remember to always show us your logic and the unrounded answer. The next question wants us to calculate using the cost calculated in B above. Here's the cost we just calculated. What would the menu sales price be today for this steak if we had a food cost percent of 38%? So again, we need to figure out the selling price. To do that, we need the food cost and a food cost percent. So using the cost we've just calculated in B, we have a cost of $3.34. We're going to divide that by the food cost percent, which they gave us in the question. So $3.34 divided by 38% gives us a rounded answer of $8.79. There's the new selling price for this particular steak after we've added the new inflation price with a new food cost percent. Continuing on, and still with the same question, we still have a present day cost of $3.20 for the steak and a food cost percent of 40%. They're telling us now that the cost of all the other items in that menu we looked at, except for the steak, because we know the steak costs $3.20, but they're telling us everything else except the steak is $2. If the food cost percent remains at 40%, what should the sales price be for this particular menu? So what we need to do is calculate the selling price using the cost of everything else plus the cost of the steak. That's going to give us the entire cost of that menu we saw at the top. So again, there's the cost of the steak plus the cost of all the other items. And it's in brackets because we need to get the value of this first, and then we're going to divide it by the 40% food cost. So $3.20 plus $2 is $5.20 divided by a 40% food cost. We see that we would sell that entire menu for $13. Now we come down to the same menu sales price, but we want to add 7 months of inflation rates using the rate of 4.5% that we had above. So the first thing we have to do is we have to get a unit cost for our annual rate. The annual rate is 4.5% or decimal 0.45. Let's divide that by 12, the amount of months in a year. So by dividing the annual rate by 12 months, the answer will be the inflation rate for 1 month. We'll take that 1 month inflation rate and multiply it by the 7 months we're looking for. Or in other words, based on a 4.5% yearly inflation rate, a 7-month rate is 2.625%. We need to add that to our current selling price of $13. So again, $13 times decimal 0.2625, the decimal equivalent of 2.625%, plus the $13, rounded off to the nearest cent, our new sales price becomes $13.34. Or the one step shorter way, the selling price of $13 times 1.02625. And again, it gets us there in one step, and we get the same answer. So without inflation, our selling price would be $13. If we factor in 7 months worth of inflation, the price jumps to $13.34. One last example. Here's a bit of a new menu, different deals, everything looking quite good. This is what we're going to work with. So the information that they give us is that the present cost of the beef tenderloin steak is $4.70, and the food cost percent is 28%. First question, just like before, what's the selling price of the beef tenderloin, rounding to the nearest cent? So again, to figure out the selling price, we're going to take the cost, and we're going to divide it by the food cost percent, or $4.70 divided by 28%, rounded to the nearest cent, $16.79. That should be the selling price if we were only selling the tenderloin. Now we look at this inflation rate question again, and this time the inflation rate for the year is 3.75%. They want to know what the cost of the beef tenderloin will be in 1 year from now. So we need to add 3.75% to the cost of the steak. Not the selling price, but the cost. So again, we take the cost of $4.70, we multiply it by 3.75%, or decimal 0.375, the decimal equivalent, and then add it back to the $4.70, unrounded number. Rounded number becomes $4.88. And of course, there's the one-step process, the cost of $4.70 multiplied by 1.0375, and again, we get to the very same answer as we did using the other method. So now they want us to use the cost we've just calculated in B above. This is the cost we've calculated. And they want us to tell us what the selling price should be if the food cost percent is 35%. So we should take the cost, we should divide it by the food cost percent, and that is going to get us the new sales price, $13.94. In question D, they want us to look at the entire menu and set a selling price. They're telling us the cost of all of the other items, except for the beef tenderloin, is $2.80. We know the beef tenderloin is $4.70, everything else is $2.80, so we have to add that and divide it by the food cost percent of 28%. So, how do we do that? There it is. The cost of the tenderloin plus the cost of everything else in brackets, because that's what we have to calculate first, and then we'll divide that by 28%, round it off to the nearest cent, $26.79. That's what the sales price would be today. Now, if the menu sales price per person 5 months from now, let's take a look at what the annual interest rate of 3.75% do here. Or in other words, we have to add 5 months of inflation to the current selling price. The first thing we're going to do is figure out exactly how much annual interest there is in a 5-month period. So here's decimal 0375, the decimal equivalent of 3.75%, the yearly rate. Let's divide the yearly rate by 12 and then take the monthly rate and multiply it by the 5 months we're asked for. So in this particular case, 5 months of inflation is 1.5625%. Let's take our current selling price, multiply it by decimal 015625, the decimal equivalent of 1.5625%, and add it back to 26.79, rounding it off to the nearest penny. The new 5-month inflation selling price is $27.21. You can see it's gone up. That's what inflation does. And very quickly, the last step to look at here, we could take the current selling price and multiply it by 1 and the 5 months worth of inflation rate. And when we round it off to the same place, we get the exact same answer. And a couple of last little exercises. What would the cost of this meal be for 50 people at today's prices? Well, here's today's price, $26.79. We didn't go 5 months from now. We took today's price, we multiplied it by 50, and we get $1,339.50. What would this cost be of the customer if we gave the customer a 10% savings for these 50 people? So we are going to take the current price, we're going to multiply it by 10%, and we see that they're going to save $133.95. Since this is a savings, we're going to subtract it from the original bill. So $1,339.50 minus $133.95, there is what they would have to pay after the 10% discount has been given. Or we have another way that we can look at this quickly. If we're saving 10%, that means we're only paying for 90%. So if we multiply the original price or cost for 50 people by 90%, this will give us the exact same answer as taking 10% off the price. If you don't understand this part, it's okay. Let's just figure out what 10% of the cost is and subtract it. But if we're saving 10%, we're only paying for 90%. Anytime you multiply a number by 90%, you get 90% of that number. Whichever way works best for you, I'm okay with. Make sure you show me your logic and the unrounded answer and round to the proper area when you're asked.